Morning to everyone. Uh, it's a real privilege and an honor for me to introduce one of my most illustrious seniors, Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan. I had the honor and privilege of working under him, and he was the Foreign Secretary. Uh, a little background about Riaz Muhammad Khan Saab is that he has spent nearly 40 years in the Foreign Service of Pakistan. He started his career and his first posting was to Beijing in 1970. Uh, in his distinguished career, he has served as Pakistan's ambassador to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union. He has also served as Pakistan's ambassador to China from 2002 to 2005, and then as the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan from 2005 to 2008. Uh, as Foreign Secretary, he was the head of the Pakistan delegation to Pakistan's India Composer Dialogue and Pakistan US Strategic Dialogue. He has also led Pakistan's delegation to the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. Ambassador Khan has written extensively. He also spent a year as a scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and has served as Pakistan's envoy for back channel diplomacy with India from 2009 to 2012. He is the author of Untying the Afghan Knot, Negotiating Soviet Withdrawal. It was published by the Duke University Press in 1991, and Pakistan and Afghanistan Conflict, Extremism and Resistance to Modernity. Woodrow Wilson Center, John Hopkins University Press, Oxford University Press, 2011. One can go on and on about introducing Ambassador Khan, but I would just like to say from personal experience that apart from being an extremely accomplished diplomat, he is a person who has always assisted and helped his colleagues all along his career. And as Foreign Secretary, his services not only to the Foreign Service of Pakistan, but to his various other colleagues will always be remembered. So with this short introduction, I would now like to hand the floor to Nabila, who will give us a background of today's webinar. Over to you, Nabila.
Thank you, sir. I welcome Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan in today's webinar. I'll be giving just an overview, a broad overview of the Sino-US relations. In today's international affairs, the most significant and talked about relations are none other but the relations between the United States and China. Their relations are significant because the scope of its consequences is global. Since the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, China's GDP has risen tenfold, while contrary to the desire of the US, its political system did not change. While China initially kept its slow profile to achieve certain levels of economic development, under the leadership of President Xi Jinping, unleashed its potential of investments through its Belt and Road Initiative. And unlike the past, China also became politically assertive, especially on the key issues of territorial sovereignty in the South China Sea and Taiwan. It's been a decade now. The US introduced Asia Pivot, the US rebalance policy, which is now transformed to Indo-Pacific strategy and the revival of Quad. The Trump administration has set the relations on hostile mode. From the last couple of years, trade war has escalated and political and security concerns are rising between the two countries. The US also has strong misgivings about China's information technology infrastructure. The US has strongly opposed Huawei 5G and China's artificial intelligence. The US Congress passed bills on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, increased defense ties with Taiwan. Both countries have also waged the war of narratives. The US backlash of China over coronavirus added further fuel to the fire. And it was understood that there will be continuation of policies of the previous administration to suppress China. Now I'll be sharing the recent developments. On 8th April, the US Department of Commerce added 7 Chinese supercomputing entities to a US economic blacklist. This is the first time since US President Joe Biden took office that it expanded the scale of the list to crack down on Chinese companies. In addition to that, on the same day, a number of US senators introduced a draft measure titled the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, which is to be reviewed by the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee next week. The act proposes sanctions on more Chinese officials over Xinjiang, cancelled restrictions on mutual visits between US and Taiwan Island officials, and providing military assistance worth of billions dollars to Indo-Pacific allies, and monitoring China's ballistic missiles. Many experts call it a new Cold War. In the present scenario, the US will try to re-engage its partners and allies to restore its leadership and moral authority, which was eroded under the Trump's presidency. The EU, however, the European Union, signed an investment deal with China in December 2020. Now, many experts also believe that to maintain hegemony, the US needs continued struggle to keep Russia's energy and China's technology away from Europe. With this background, now we'll be looking how there'll be the future course of relations between China and the US. Now I hand over the floor to the President.
Thank you very much, Nabila. Sir, the floor is yours. We will really appreciate if you could enlighten us with your views for about 30 minutes, and then we could get into a question-answer session. Thank you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, and thank you, Ms. Nabila Jafar. Ambassador Nadeem Riaz has very generously introduced me. I don't deserve that, but thank you. I'll be talking about the current status of China-US relations. But let me say that for the last 1 decade or so, this relationship has become increasingly tension-ridden. Partly, I would say that President Trump's election campaign also focused on this and basically talked about that how the Chinese had exploited shifting of jobs from United States, how China has literally overwhelmed economically the United States, and that how it was asserting itself around the world. So over these years, what has happened is that now a certain suspicion of China that it is trying to overtake United States preponderance in the world, it has become, and also that it is damaging the interests of the Americans, it has become a popular ethos. So we find that when Biden came, he has essentially maintained the same policies. Now there is volumes of material available on China-US tensions, how it impacts the regional and global politics, what it portends for world future. And it is really very difficult to say anything new. I think very briefly, Nabila Jafar has already highlighted some of the current aspects of this tension. Nonetheless, since international relations, nothing can be predicted with certainty, and literally nothing can be ruled out. There is always room for argument and discussion. Many questions have been raised. The IRS paper which was sent to me, that raised 4 questions. What are the major dimensions of Sino-US relations? Why China is concerned about revival of Quad? What are the fixed strategic objectives of US and China? What are the key areas of cooperation? Alternatively, we can ask, is there a new Cold War? If so, how different it is from the earlier Cold War? Will the tensions necessarily lead to a conflict or generate extreme competition short of a fateful conflict? Will the compulsions of a new transformed world make cooperation between the 2 great powers inevitable? How will other regions and countries around respond to the evolving situation, and what will be the challenges for Pakistan? But before I try to address these questions, I'll make a few comments about China and United States as great societies and world power. I have been fortunate to live in both the countries for extended periods. In China, as you have already mentioned, my first posting was Beijing, 3 years from 1970 to 73, and then later on as ambassador from 2002 to 2005. And I have also dealt with China from the Foreign Office for about 6 years from 73 to 79. I have also lived in United States. I was in New York with our mission for almost 7 years. So I thought some of these comments may be relevant. China is a civilization with a continuous history of 3,000 years. It is cohesive and homogeneous, if not monolithic. Its people endowed with great discipline and faith in a capable, even if authoritarian governance, with a strong work ethics rooted in Confucian teachings, which inculcates pragmatism, respect for social relationships and social order, and a deep commitment to community. Chinese society is open but not inclusive. This is an important difference as vis-a-vis United States. United States is part of the Western and European civilizational continuum that considers itself extending into millennia as the inheritor of the Greek awakening, Roman rule of law, and Christian traditions of faith. Europe or the West can rightly claim to be the pioneers of the modern age and revolution in science and technology and knowledge that enabled them to discover and rule most part of the world. Indeed, the Industrial Revolution changed the face of the world and marked a break from the past for what counted for power among nations. The West also prides in its being the cradle of liberal thought and values, individual freedoms, and political systems based on peaceful transfer of power. The Western society is both open and largely inclusive, as it has had a history of colonial rule and interaction with diverse people for centuries. In the main, the Americans always regarded themselves to be part of the West, of Europe, and since World War II as the leader of the free world. The United States is a highly dynamic and complex society composed of large groups of immigrants who kept coming in waves, mostly from Europe. The US regards itself as exceptional, at the cutting edge of science and technology, the greatest military power on earth. Its currency dominates world trade and has become an instrument of coercion through trade sanctions. It is home to the oldest democracy. At the same time, the US suffers from internal stresses of a racial dimension, which at an emotional level clash with its espousal of democratic and liberal ideals. The phenomena has often erupted into political convulsions such as the Civil War of 1860s. The civil rights movements are a manifestation of this tension, as well as the latest Trump's anti-immigration political platform. This background I'm giving because I think it is important when you consider the strengths and weaknesses of these two great powers, that is China and the United States. And now we can discuss about the tension between them and its future direction. Since Graham Allison's suggestion in 2012 that the Sino-US relations are heading towards a classic Thucydides trap, the Sino-US tensions are viewed as the new Cold War with portents of a clash between the two powers. The US as the ruling superpower and China as emerging contender to challenge that position. But as Allison himself concedes, clash between the two powers is not inevitable. It is the avid goal of the United States at official and popular levels that the US will not allow challenge to its global primacy or let China displace its ascendance in any aspects. This sentiment has intensified because China has militarily not because China has militarily threatened the US or has equaled US military prowess, much less gained an edge militarily or strategically. Far from it, figures speak for themselves. As compared to 800 overseas US military bases, China has only 3. China's military spending is 1/3 of that of the United States, which alone possesses the ability to deploy its troops anywhere around the world. The US has been disturbed by China's phenomenal economic growth and the possibility that by the end of the decade, it may overtake US GDP. Again, to cite figures, China today holds the largest surplus capital for investment. It holds $1.3 trillion in US Treasury bonds alone. The trade deficit between US and China in favor of the latter crossed $200 billion annually. China has become the manufacturing hub of the world. In 2016, President Xi Jinping announced an ambitious Belt and Road Initiative aimed at integrating China's economy with Euro-Asian economies. China's technological development has also been moving at an astounding pace. It is now on the cutting edge in artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. Internally, the 2016 Trump campaign blamed China for the drying up of US jobs and shift of US industries to China. As president, Trump lost no time imposing heavy tariffs on imports from China and a concerted effort to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I think some of these points were also made by Ms. Nabila in her introductory presentation. At the strategic level, the US policy has become unabashedly containment of China, with both economic and strategic dimensions. Biden has continued the same policy direction as it resonates with the populist and political sentiment in the United States. But none of this confrontation and what Biden has described as the extreme competition are likely to result in a military conflict, in my view. First, China itself wishes to avoid military confrontation and understands its damaging consequences for itself. Second, the most likely flashpoint for a conflict is Asia Pacific, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and Taiwan. The economies of Asia Pacific countries from Japan to Indonesia and Singapore are so inextricably integrated with that of China that none of these countries would want disruption resulting from a major conflict in the region. China-ASEAN trade today is about $732 billion. When I say today means this is the 2020 figure. Besides thousands of joint ventures and massive investments underpinning the economies of the entire region. On South China Sea, China will, however, have to conduct its diplomacy with sensitivity and circumspection rather than push its claim of sovereignty in an aggressive manner, because, as I mentioned, the United States may be trying to find an excuse to precipitate a conflict which basically will be damaging to China, but also damaging to the region. Third, on Taiwan, where China maintains an uncompromising declared position of principle, its policy has been highly pragmatic. More than 1 million Taiwanese have permanent residence on mainland, and mutual trade reached well above $150 billion by 2018, along with massive investments that both have across the Taiwan Straits. That is, the Taiwanese in China and Chinese in Taiwan. With such intertwining of economies, there is a strong pro-China political lobby in Taiwan itself, which will be resistant to any conflict between the two. Despite tensions, I would say that the new Sino-US Cold War, if you want to describe it that way, cannot be a repeat of the US-Soviet Cold War. To start with, there is no Iron Curtain, no clearly delineated alliance systems. Globalization, information and technological revolutions, and the phenomenal global interaction among peoples has changed the world. No society can be closed as the Soviet Union was, and I can give you examples of that. Above all, economic and technological imperatives, rather than bare bones security and geopolitics, dominate global relations today. Again, the earlier containment policy simply cannot apply on the current circumstances. Containment comes natural to the Americans as for 2 generations. They regarded it as the most effective aspect of American diplomacy, which assured the US primacy and eventually, in their view, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. China has emerged as an irrepressible economic power with links spread around the globe. But this cannot be contained the way United States was able to contain the Soviet Union, where the pitch was primarily strategic and political. China's BRI, for example, cannot be contained. The US put Iran against the wall. Today, China has a long-term $400 billion agreement with Iran. Trump pulled out of Obama's TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, you would recall, initiative, only to provide China the possibility to establish Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, last year. An agreement was wrapped up for this in late 2020, which with free trade deals between China with 10 ASEAN countries, as well as Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. China has also indicated its readiness to join Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership signed in 2019 by countries on the Pacific Rim, which were originally slated to sign TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, without the United States, this time without the United States, because Trump had pulled out of TPP. Thus, today it is United States which is out rather than China, which was the intent of Obama's TPP initiative. The US policies of America first and protectionism helped China's economic outreach. Now about Quad, because there was a reference in your paper to that. Quad is undoubtedly part of the US containment approach, coupled with the US-sponsored configuration of Indo-Pacific. There is speculation that it is a precursor to an Asian NATO. Well, first I would say that Asia has a different geography, different history, and different traditions. Quad as a concept of a military alliance appears to be untenable, as most countries of the Indian Ocean Rim, especially in Southeast Asia, and even in East Africa and Gulf, will be uncomfortable with it. They can validly ask as to what the threat is and what the target is. These countries do not require a new arrangement to police the ocean. Even in India, there are voices against US warships patrolling close to its shorelines. You must have read about some criticism which appeared in the Indian papers when a US missile carrier, SS John Paul, came close to the Lakshadweep Islands in April 7, that is last week. By its own claim, Quad is meant to evolve a code of conduct for freedom of navigation. That is at best, in my view, amorphous and raises more questions than provides answers. However, when it comes to Quad, I think more than China, because China's preoccupations are in the Asia Pacific region, and as I mentioned, Southeast, sorry, um, the Southeast Sea and Eastern Pacific. But more than China, countries like Pakistan must keep an eye on the direction of development of Quad. What is its purpose? How will it impact on us in case there is an attempt by some of these countries which are part of it to develop the so-called code of conduct for freedom of navigation. By definition, these kinds of codes of conduct, first of all, they must not conflict with law of the sea convention, and secondly, it must have the endorsement of all the rim countries of the ocean, that is the Indian Ocean. Now, there is no doubt that globalization has slowed down by virtue of the American retreat into protectionism and the rising anti-immigration sentiments in the West, the antagonism between United States and China. But the phenomena by and large survives as it is linked to the revolution in communications and technology, which is a modern phenomenon. And China has become an indispensable player in the globalized world. The Western fears of China's economic dominance may have a constricting impact on the phenomena, but it cannot blunt China's continuing outreach and engagement with the rest of the world. Take, for example, BRI. The over $1 trillion planned investments in infrastructure development may slow down, but will eventually materialize. One important advantage that China enjoys is the trust that China has been able to engender, that its economic engagement does not lead to military pressures or arm twisting or political interference in internal affairs. The American argument about debt trap to wean the beneficiaries away from the initiative do not appear convincing when the Chinese show willingness to renegotiate terms of projects. Secondly, US itself has lost the capacity to be a viable alternative source for capital for such investments. China's technological challenge to the US and in general to the West, in my view, is also exaggerated. Yes, China has now world-class institutions for teaching and research in science and technology. Like Japan, I think China will emerge as leader in some technologies such as renewable energy. But generally, the West will remain on the cutting edge. The fact that China sends hundreds of thousands of students to the West to learn technology and science points to West's primacy, which has centuries of tradition in being at the vanguard of scientific knowledge. The US in particular enjoys one great advantage over all other societies, as it is a magnet for attracting talent from all over the world. China has yet to develop that kind of appeal. Militarily, the American preponderance is obvious. However, here also, the experience of interventions, US interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq ought to be sobering, both for the United States and the countries who may consider being a US partner in a military misadventure. Secondly, the strategic thinking over an all-out clash between the superpowers or even between two nuclear-armed powers has considerably matured. The Cold War had seen its days of relentless arms race. After 50 years, however, the two superpowers, when Reagan and Gorbachev had met, reached the conclusion that a nuclear clash is not winnable and must be avoided. That consensus reached in nuclear deterrence theology still holds. The new war scenarios are far more complex and involve space, cyber, artificial intelligence technologies. Today, at the international level, debates are more in the nature of how to regulate these new capabilities rather than how to use them for military purposes. These technologies are more of a challenge that require a global response and cooperation among major powers. New technologies are not only not the only challenge requiring global understanding and action. There are others looming large on the horizon: climate change, pandemics, environmental degradation, food security, water security, and population growth. At the global level, especially among younger generation, there is increasing sensitivity to these threats. The United States cannot remain oblivious to the imperative of global cooperation to address them. This is evident in Biden's initiative for Climate Change Summit, in a stark contrast to his predecessor's denial of climate change. And for the summit that they are having, they have invited China along with 39 other countries. Thus, the requirement of the new age demand cooperation and do not sit well with a policy of confrontation between China and United States. Even if tensions persist on various specifics of international relations, in particular trade and economic engagement and rivalry in technological fields. These tensions will undoubtedly bring pressures on some countries, but it is unlikely to reach a point where they will perforce have to choose between one side or the other, that is, United States or China. The US cannot impose the choice of you are either with us or against us, as it stated soon after 9/11. 9/11 was a very different situation. The world is multipolar, and most countries can pursue their relations based mostly on their economic interests in a world where geoeconomics has assumed increasing importance. Now I come to Pakistan, because all this has relevance to us, direct relevance to us. Pakistan has unique and difficult situation because of its neighborhood. Pakistan's principal position on Kashmir has earned it India's hostility, which is emerging as a strong partner of United States. And at the same time, we see that India's relations with China are beset with border tensions and friction. In our northwest, Afghanistan remains afflicted with an almost generational civil war and outside intervention. For these reasons and its own errors of policy, Pakistan continues to suffer, especially its economy. Opportunities that could have opened up by taking advantage of its geographical location remain blocked so far. In this scenario, the importance of Pakistan-China relations and in that context is indispensable. we should not be nervous that the US would impose a choice, a policy choice on us. Yes, US policy is very clear. They would like to put a wedge between Pakistan and China, but that is their policy. For Pakistan, we must act in our own interest, and we must not allow dilution of our time-tested relations with China. We talk about emphasis on geoeconomics in our foreign relations. The new emphasis, there's been a lot of debate on it. That primarily means taking advantage of a country's geographical location for economic development and its own economic capacity to engage with other countries. Pakistan's economic capacities regrettably remain limited, partly owing to external circumstances, in particular Afghanistan, and the fallout of the Afghan war in terms of extremist violence, and partly because of our own misguided policies. We allowed, for example, these armed, autonomous groups in our country, and any country which allows armed, autonomous groups on its soil is doomed, in my view. Hopefully, the recent movement that is visible on the Afghan conflict could lead to peace. With India, we cannot overlook the suffering and human rights violations of Kashmiris. Until there is improvement on these two fronts, Afghanistan and India, much of the potential for north-south connectivity in commerce and projects as pipelines from Central Asia and Iran will remain theoretical. Meanwhile, our opportunities for development are linked to investment from China and development of CPEC, which must be pursued ignoring detractors of CPEC or detractors of China-Pakistan relations. Even when the situation moves towards peace, development of CPEC will help the process and become a vehicle for stability and progress in the region. So these are some of my comments, general comments. I'm now ready to take any questions that you may have.
Nabila, you could kindly moderate the session, please.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive presentation. Now we open the floor for question and answer sessions. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
Nabila, I want to ask a question.
Okay. Over to you, Imran.
Thank you very much. It was really a balancing presentation between the China and the US relations. So, in my point of view, the conflict is going to be shifted to the South China Sea instead of South Asia. China has categorically stated that the Beijing will oppose anyone using the freedom of navigation as an excuse to undermine the sovereignty and the security of countries in the South China Sea. China wants Article 6 of 1992 law on its territorial sea and contiguous zone, which he called the Buffalo Zone, to be respected. for military purpose, it has categorically stated that China shall be, it will be subjected to the approval of the government of China. But United States says that China, South China is an international sea and cannot become a Chinese lake. So there are many things going on in which I have just recently attended a webinar organized by the Institute of International Center for Security Studies in France, in which they categorically stated with some snapshots that US Navy and Chinese Navy, they were just about to confront on the South China Sea. And the situation was very alarming on that side, because I have seen shots and clips over there, and they have some military intelligence reports with them. So in that kind, I think the situation as we are thinking or we are just reading from the newspaper is different. It's entirely, and the situation on the ground in the South China Sea is.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
Intervene, Imran. Could you please ask the question? Because
just
we
wanted
have
to-
limited time. Thank you very much.
My question just simply is that the situation on the ground is dangerous, but on the other hand, we are just projecting that this is the same situation and no conflict is going on in the near future. So, what's your take on this? On this
Well, thank you. Partly this is something that I was trying to address. Look, first of all, the South China Sea and East China Sea, these are areas of primary interest for China. In fact, the entire Asia Pacific is area of primary interest. Now, of course, China is also present in a big way in the framework of SCO in Central Asia. China will have to, you must be knowing the history of the 9 dashes, how it was Sun Yat-sen who thought that this should be China's boundaries, maritime boundaries. Anyway, there is about $5 trillion worth of commerce which passes through East China Sea and South China Sea, and then through the Straits of Malacca and onwards to Europe, etc. Therefore, China cannot assert its sovereignty in a straitjacket manner on South China Sea or East China Sea. East China Sea, in fact, is a different story because there is Taiwan and there is Japan's very strong interest over there. There are a couple of islands where there is dispute. So China will have to soften its stand in practical terms, stand on with regard to asserting its sovereignty on the various islands in South China Sea in particular. The Americans, but more than Americans, I would say it should be sensitive to the concerns of some of the countries of the region, like Philippines, like Vietnam, who have been upset about the solidification of these islands by China to create permanent bases over there. Nonetheless, as far as the question of freedom of navigation is concerned for commerce, and the Americans, to provoke the situation, they push freedom of patrolling by their naval vessels. China will have to be extremely careful in handling that. In fact, in 2009, I was invited to Singapore for a conference in which these subjects were discussed. And at that time, I had also stated that it would be better if China developed some kind of a partnership with some of the regional countries, like, as I said, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, who have also claims over the maritime boundary for exploitation of resources in the area. If they can have some joint ventures for exploitation of resources, that would be basically underpinnings for peace in that, for keeping peace in that area. But it must avoid being provoked by any activity by the United States naval vessels or even European naval vessels. Even Germany sent a naval vessel into the South China Sea area just to make a point that, look, this is not a Chinese lake, this is basically an open sea. So this is one thing that I'll say about, you mentioned balancing. Balancing is being used these days in one other context, which I want to point out. It is, I have seen some articles, etc. There should be some balancing by Pakistan between China and United States, etc. We should absolutely never discuss our relations with China and with United States, other countries, as an act of balance. No, we have bilateral relations with China, we have bilateral relations with United States, others, and they ought to be pursued on their own merits. So balancing you have used in a very in a different context, but it sort of came to my mind that I'll make this point here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we have another question. Ms. Safia Malik has a question. Ms. Safia Malik.
Thank you so much. It was so nice presentation, Mr. Riaz. I'm Safia Malik from Karachi, and recently I'm doing MPhil International Relations from the University of Karachi and working as an assistant researcher at Prince Mohammed bin Fahad University, Saudi Arabia. Sir, I have really one question. You are discussing about the Graham Allison quote, and also I just want to ask just one thing, that the confrontation between China and India, don't you think so that the confrontation between two parties would lead the confrontation and the tussle between the US and China? Because recently China has announced to build a dam on Brahmaputra, that is the river that drives from Tibet, and that directly links towards the 7 states of India. So this is creating a conflict between the two states. Don't you think so that the water conflict between India and China would create the confrontation between US and China? This is the first part. And secondly, please focus and please delineate this all the most important point, that is the policy of Pakistan, that which kind of policy Pakistan has to adopt in case of US China confrontation, because we have at this stage, should we do bandwagon, or should we adopt the policy of the balancing? If the China and US are cooperating each other, so why we are not going towards the to follow up the policy of the balancing? Thank you so much.
Look, I think balancing I tried to address when I was addressing the earlier question. Balancing means that, you know, we have to be somewhere in middle ground as far as our relations with China and United States are concerned. If you look at the history of relationship that we had with United States and we have had with China, that kind of proposition is quite untenable. Most of our investments, for example, today, for that we look towards China in the context of CPEC or bilaterally. Most of our strategic relationship, help, etc., technology, other things, we have to look towards China. In United States, our students do not even get admission STEM subjects, science and technology subjects. By the way, I believe that the most important part of education for any nation, for any country, is the STEM subjects, the science, technology, mathematics, engineering, etc. Not that much social sciences, where our students do get access. Anyway, so basically we have to, and as a country, we are not just mid-sized country, we are more than that. We are also quite a powerful country from certain aspects. So we are quite capable of pursuing an independent policy which is based on our interests. We do not want any hostility with the United States. We are cooperating on the issue of peace in Afghanistan with the United States, but United States, for its own reasons, which are understandable, has chosen India to be the natural ally, to be a partner in the region. Yes, that is quite all right, but then that must not be at the cost of Pakistan's own interests. So we have to be watchful about it. So far, that situation has not come. Your second part of your question is about India, China tensions, etc., and whether United States will intervene in that. I personally don't think that the India-China tensions, they will remain. Friction will remain. Suspicions against each other will, and distrust will remain. But the issues are so limited because it's a question of, for example, the last tensions that they had was on the issue of where lies the line of actual control. It was not territorial in that sense that the Chinese were trying to get into the Arunachal Pradesh, which they claim theoretically, and India was trying to get into Aksai Chin, which India claims theoretically. It's a long issue, the border issue. You should read Neville Maxwell's book, which is a classic, India's China War, to understand the background of this issue. But what I am saying is that it is so limited in context that personally I don't think that it can lead to a full-scale conflict between China and India. And you have seen that how the two countries, they did make effort to bring things under control. Your last point was about Brahmaputra, the water issues. Water issues are very sensitive issues, touchy issues for nations, countries. But here, more than India, it is Bangladesh which would be affected because Brahmaputra waters come into Bangladesh. So the question is that how these countries are going to work out a satisfactory solution. For example, whether the dam which is being constructed is flow of the river dam, that means it is just to produce electricity and there would be no diversion of water. On that, there ought to be no big tension. The Indus Water Treaty allows on the waters of rivers which belong to Pakistan, it allows flow of the river dams for the purpose of producing electricity. So whether it is that or it is something else, these are some of the technical matters which are related to it. The other thing which is important is that Brahmaputra's main source of water, when it enters into India and then into Bangladesh, is the rainwater of monsoons, which is enormous. So here it also depends that what is the quantity of water which will be affected if there is this dam. So these are my observations.
Thank you, sir. Now we have another question from the President IRS. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Nabila. Sir, I just wanted to have your views. In fact, a few days ago, in a telephone call, Joe Biden suggested an alternative to the BRI to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Do you think that given the state of the American economy, they would have the might as well as the money to do something like this, given the fact that nearly about 100 countries are in some sort of a arrangement with China regarding various projects on the BRI? Your comments, please.
Well, yeah, there was this idea floated by Joe Biden, but he did not give any specifics about it. China's BRI is very specific, very concrete in terms of its concept and in terms of what is to be done. It's basically a land mass based Eurasia, China's BRI. And it did not came out of the blue. It's important to recall that once the Central Asian republics became independent in 1991, December 1991, the first thing that China did in 1992 was to offer to these countries boundary agreements on the existing boundaries which they had disputed while it was the boundaries of the Soviet Union. Because many areas of Kazakhstan, for example, even Almaty and Semipalatinsk, China had territorial claims on that, and they used to say that they were ceded by the Chinese under pressure to the Tsarist expansion under unequal treaties. But in 1992, they immediately offered the Central Asian countries, which were very weak as compared to the Soviet Union, to have these agreements. They were very happy, these countries, and they immediately signed in 1993. These agreements were signed. Once these agreements were signed, there were two things which happened. One was a trust was established between the Central Asian countries and China. It was restored. Secondly, it gave the possibility of China to open road links and railway links with Central Asia, which they did. And there is also a pipeline, oil pipeline from the Caspian Basin to Aktoube to Urumqi, which has been completed. So within, say, a few years' time, China was the largest trading partner of Central Asian countries. There were three road links which connected China with Central Asia. Then they also had agreement with Russia, and they opened up a link from China right up to Europe, railway link. So these things had become very active already, and there was a lot of commerce which was flowing. Then they even, China and Russia, they agreed on a political framework of Shanghai Cooperation, SCO, Cooperation Organization, to see to it that there is no political interference from outside, and that they become the guarantors for security in the region. So these were things which were done much before the BRI initiative. BRI initiative is based on all that was already achieved, both in the political sense, economic sense, infrastructure, communications. And CPEC is in fact one branch line of the BRI. Now, what is the idea of Joe Biden and United Kingdom, both are basically, United Kingdom is an island, essentially an island. So do they have something to offer? The United States, yes, a great power, superpower, but it can only think in terms of some kind of cooperation in trade and commerce, which is based on mutual concessions like tariff reductions, etc., all that. But there, I think they will have the problems which they faced in the past. For example, I had mentioned about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the fate of that, which was basically launched by Obama. And he thought that there could be this community of countries along the Asia Pacific rim, minus China, who can have lower tariffs, etc., all that. And then what happened? Trump threw it out. So now you have a substitute in which China has made an ingress. So these are things that we have to see. But so far, I think Joe Biden initiative is very amorphous and undefined.
Thank you, sir. Now we have 6 more questions. Ms. Humaira Iqbal from IRS, she has a question. Humaira.
For a very good presentation. And my question is that today, in the contemporary times, when we see the level of economic openness and the growth in China, which was actually unthinkable 30 years ago, and is still being resisted by the US. And if we look at the warning words of Henry Kissinger to Washington, that he said that the US must accept the new global system, or it may face a pre-World War I geopolitical situation. So do you think that US under Biden administration would be ready to accept the changing world order? And do you think that Europe would follow their own independent interest in collaborating with China? Thank you.
Yeah. Look, first of all, I think the world situation imposes itself on countries, even if they are superpowers. It is not that a superpower is almighty to be able to impose what its own wishes over the world. So the new, what you are saying is new global system. Now, new global system, as I think people now say, and in my presentation I was mentioning, that today the economic parameters, they have become predominant in global relationships, trade, investments, interaction. It's a changed world, a globalized world. Now, globalization may slow down, but globalization cannot be reversed. And in globalization, in this phenomena of globalization, one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization has been China itself. For example, China's trade with United States. Look at that. China's investments from into United States and from United States into China. In 2003, I remember one of the ministers, Chinese ministers, had told me that there were 40,000 US joint ventures at that time working in mainland China. So this is a different world. Similarly, on Taiwan, you know, I mentioned about that. In Shanghai alone, at that time, 700,000 Taiwanese were residents, and at that time, about $53 billion worth of investments from Taiwan had come into China. Now, you do not see that kind of parallel during the earlier Cold War between United States and Soviet Union. I don't think that there is much time, but otherwise I'll give you some stories about, interesting stories about why Soviet Union was a closed system and why it could not withstand the rigors of the electronic revolution, the information revolution, and that was one of the important factors which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anyway, so coming back to your new system, the new system is already there, and it is a globalized system in which there is phenomenal interaction between peoples, between in commerce, in other terms, and this is something which is not going to be wished away by United States. And United States will have to adjust to it, because policies under Trump also, they were unable to so to say, put a stop to the globalization in the world. In fact, the trade between China and United States almost remained the same as in the earlier days, despite the fact that Trump had imposed high tariffs on more than $200 billion worth of imports from China. Then you look at I was mentioning about the benefits. China used to send, in 2018, there were 400,000 Chinese students in American universities, basically learning scientific subjects, technology and science. These are countries, who are very, very conscious of what needs to be done in order to create a place for themselves in the world order. They are not unlike us, who had also opportunities in the 50s and to a certain extent in the 80s, but we never thought of training our students in these areas, sending them there. We could have sent thousands of students to learn sciences in the 1950s, but we did not. We purchased things. We purchased Patton tanks. We purchased the F-104s, etc. They were also necessary, but we could have done. But we did not have the sensitivity towards these imperatives of the modern age, which is basically the modernization of your education, your economy, your defenses, all these things. Anyway, that's a different subject. So I hope I have tried to address your...
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So we have another 4 questions, and we would like to address them very briefly. Ms. Tabinda Siddiqui has a question.
Why don't you have all the questions? Then I can.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Okay, sir. We can take questions one by one. Ms. Tabinda Siddiqui, am I audible
sure.
to you? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
yes, you are audible, and I hope I'm audible too.
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Very pertinent presentation by Mr. Riaz Mohammad Khan. Sir, my question is that your perspective reflects quite optimistic view of the situation, especially with reference to Pakistan's bilateral relations with United States and China. You have stated that Pakistan has relations with both of the countries, and Pakistan should keep moving on the bilateral lines. But question arises here, sir, that if by virtue of our geography, Pakistan is forced once again to take a side of one of the superpowers or one of the powers in this case, how difficult the situation would be for Pakistan? Would we be able to take sides, especially keeping in view the type of relations we have with China and type of relations we have with United States? Like, conflict seems quite open in the horizon. Like, it seems that in coming years, if not in coming months, but in coming years, things would change in the region, and the region would be driven into another conflict. So what would be the Pakistan's choices, and how should Pakistan deal with those situations? Kindly do reflect upon them.
Now we can move to another question. Mr. Wasim Sajjad has a question. Over to you, Wasim.
Thank you, ma'am. First of all, thank you, sir, for a very fascinating talk. My question is regarding the technology which you mentioned in your talk many times. So how dangerous this new technology could be in the case of US-China conflict, because the states are now increasingly using this new tech like artificial intelligence and cyberspace for defensive and as well as offensive purposes. So in the case of US and China, how dangerous this could be, as we are just listening this news from Iran about their nuclear facility being attacked by a cyber attack. Thank you.
Now we can move towards the third question. Mr. Amir Iqbal, please ask the question. Am I audible to you, Mr. Amir? Okay,
Yes,
he
ma'am.
has. Okay, please.
Ma'am, first of all, I would like to thanks to the respected speaker or comprehensive presentation. Sir, my question is that despite all the differences between the US and China, which is continues after the Biden administration as well, after the Trump administration as well in the current government. And recently, the concluded talks between the US official and Chinese diplomats in Alaska, the two sides separately released announcements in which they both identified limited areas of cooperation and coordination with respect to climate change and geopolitical issues related to Iran, North Korea, Myanmar, and Afghanistan, while acknowledging fundamental disagreements regarding Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan issues. So, sir, one thing is we see in different that the Biden administration is looking at global issues with China collectively. So, is there any chances, according to the functionalist theory, that the common global areas, the non-political areas, especially climate change and the other issues identified in these talks, is it possible that they will spillover effect on their bilateral relation as well? And is there any possibility of normalization of relation between the two states?
Okay. Is that over?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there are these three questions. So the first question, you remarked that I was optimistic about our relations, Pakistan's relations with the US and with China. I don't think that I was very optimistic about our relations with United States, in the sense that the arena of where cooperation is possible and where we can benefit from this relationship, it has shrunken quite a bit. It's diminished. With China, there are possibilities. CPEC is one possibility and many others. China, with that, we have a very strong political relationship. We don't have any problems. Now, with United States, the first imperative of policy has to be that we should avoid hostility in this relationship. We have to temper down our expectations from United States. For example, if you are thinking that Pakistan will be able to get military hardware, Pakistan will be able to get technologies or assistance, economic assistance in some some significant scale, then I think we are misleading ourselves. We should shed these kinds of notions, but we should have a cooperative relationship wherever cooperation is possible. Afghanistan is one area where cooperation is important and is possible. We should also try to engage them after Afghanistan settles down in some kind of economic activity in Afghanistan, and for projects, important projects like TAPI, the Turkmen Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, those kinds of projects. So there is absolutely no question and nobody will advocate that we should in any way confront a superpower like United States. So we should try to have a normal relationship with United States. We should also understand its limitations, because certainly we cannot supplant the kind of relationship which is developing between United States and India, because there the motivations, the basic factors are now quite different. So this, I would say, the other thing that you had said was that because of our geographical position, are we going to be sucked into another conflict? You see, geographical position, we have been quite mesmerized by our geographical position without even realizing what it, in practical terms, what does it mean? You see, Afghanistan gave us some notion that Soviet Union was heading towards the warm waters. United States came. There was this thing, cooperation to stave off the Soviet pressure. In that, we got some assistance from United States. Again, I would say that there was that good relationship between the two sides, and we were not able to take the full advantage the way China was able to take full advantage in the 80s, in the 90s, and in the early 2000s. So we were not able to do that thing. Let me, I hope you people have some time. Let me give you just one example. I was an ambassador in China. I went to the workshops where JF-17 was being manufactured. Now, this was a huge place spread over an area of, I think, 2 square kilometers or so. And with the CEO, he took us into the factory. And there were huge machineries, big machines, computer sealed, computer operated, as large as 2-3 rooms put together. And there on the girders, I found in cast iron, it was written Cincinnati, Cincinnati. So naturally, they were imported from Cincinnati. So I asked the CEO, I said, when did you get these machines from United States? So he smiled and he said, these are one of the first things that we imported in 1980s when our relationship opened up with the West. Did we have that kind of thinking? I am afraid that the answer is no. We did not have that. Now, geopolitical situation. Afghanistan, if you go into the history of Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Soviet Union came not because it was seeking the warm waters. Now the debates in the Politburo, Soviet Politburo are there available. It was because they wanted to change Hafizullah Amin. That's a longish story. I will not go into that. But nonetheless, it in a way gave us a prominent position. Now, which kind of conflict do you see in which there would be our geopolitical situation is going to play a part? Are we going to be a corridor for any American misadventure against China? Or what? Are we going to be a base for United States for any actions against Iran? What are we talking about? We should be more specific when we talk about these things. Yeah. Okay.
Was in the context of Iranian in the context of China-US relations?
China-US
Specifically.
relations. So if China-US, God forbid, if they are to fight, they will be fighting in Asia Pacific. They will not be fighting on the
Really?
Kunjara Pass.
Really? We see a lot of opposition of CPEC projects, sir, and we are the only country that are providing this access to China.
You see this the resistance of this by people who write in papers. I don't know how it is inspired. Who inspires this kind of a thing? We should look at these things on their own merit. If, for example, there have been any misappropriations or corruption in negotiating the projects, which are basically the energy projects, and there is nobody who can ever doubt about the necessity of energy in Pakistan at that time when Pakistan was suffering, its cities were suffering, electric shutdowns for hours every day. So
yes,
the thing is that there you have to first blame yourself. First blame yourself because you did not negotiate the right thing and you were part of that corruption. And then the second thing is that for the projects in the future, you have to see to it that no such corruption takes place. We can also renegotiate the terms of the loans that we have received in that context with China. That door is not shut, but rather than making propaganda in our papers, which is certainly going to rankle with the Chinese, we should basically approach them in a serious manner, if at all we want to do that. So then secondly, along this corridor, there are so-called plans for special economic zones. Now, on special economic zones, one of the basic criteria is one window operation. Where is that one window operation in Pakistan? Anywhere, right? If our own administration and governance has collapsed, then we should not be blaming others for our condition. So we have to look into all these things. Why importance of China is because that is the only source of capital that is available to us for investments, etc. I mean, say under pressure, whose pressure, I don't know. When the Saudis, they said that we want to get our money back, the $3 billion, where did we go to get that money to pay to the Saudis? We went to
China. Of course, to China.
So
yes.
I would say these are some of the things. So I hope I have basically
just a comment, sir. I guess I have not expressed myself very well. My question was regarding that if in the case of conflict, if conflict emerges and the nature of relations we have with the two powers, what would be the Pakistan's position? And
first of all, in my presentation, what I was saying was that the conflict is a far, far removed possibility because the area of conflict is not Central Asia, not India, Pakistan, but it will be basically Asia Pacific, the South China Sea, East China Sea, that would be. And I believe that the main resistance to avert a conflict will not come from United States. United States may be itching for some kind of a kinetic action over there, but it will come from the countries of the region because their economy will suffer. They will be destroyed. Vietnam will be destroyed. The Philippines economy will be destroyed. Are these people mad? They are, I think, very pragmatic people. So despite their differences, which will remain, which will be difficult to resolve anytime soon, but they will probably not want that their area should become subject to a conflict between the two great powers, and it is devastated by virtue of that. So that is
Sure.
it. But anyway, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, that in international relations, nothing can be ruled out. So my suggestion would be that if at all there is a conflict,
Mhm.
please don't try to get involved with it. And that would be our choice. So I don't see that conflict coming anytime, but we should not.
Yeah,
try to-
hopefully. But yeah, Afghan crisis determined that we were not actually able to
and-
maintain neutrality. Sometimes you are forced to take sides.
Yeah, one thing that I may also mention to you is please do not be fascinated or seduced by cliches.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much, sir.
Neutrality, balancing act, this, that,
Sure, sir.
etc.
Sure. I wish we would be able to do that.
Very practical and very down to earth when it comes to even international relations. I used to admire some of these people in Southeast Asia because by virtue of our English, we looked very smart diplomats. But where have they gone and where are we today with all our smartness? So basically, we have to be very practical and pragmatic. Now, I hope I have addressed this question. Now, the other question was about technology by Mr. Wasim Sajjad. Dangerous technologies, US, China. Look, this is a basically philosophical question. Any technology that can be useful, that can be dangerous, that can have any. When the Hittites discovered steel, one use was they made swords with it, which were much stronger, and they conquered the ancient Egyptian dynasty and established another dynasty of their own. But the other the use of steel that they produced, they discovered at that time was, agriculture, many other things. So technology cuts both ways. But I think there is always a sensitivity about technology, that how its dangerous edge is restrained and how its positive edge is positive sort of application is promoted. Take, for example, nuclear technology. It's a very important technology of the day. Nuclear weapons. After 50 years of arms race, etc., as I mentioned, the two superpowers, and I think mainly the other powers also who are nuclear, they agreed on this, that nuclear war must not be initiated. Even in case of Pakistan and India, this is an extremely important factor which restrains India. It protects us from aggression, but also it doesn't give us the leverage that we can go and engage in some misadventures, military misadventures here and there. But it provides us a defense. So that is the positive aspect. The other aspect, its destructive aspects are very apparent. Why are the Israelis and the Americans are so, doggedly pursuing to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power? But in case of Pakistan, we have been very fortunate. It's a quirk of history that we have been able to get this technology. We have, in fact, ended up a third route to nuclear weaponization, centrifuge, whereas the two other routes, the diffusion and reprocessing, were developed at Manhattan Project in 1940s by United States, and all other countries who are nuclear weapon states, they basically pursued those routes. We were denied we were blocked from pursuing those routes. But then A.Q. Khan brought something and then developed, innovated, etc. And we have now this capability, and this capability is today central to our defense and security. So the technologies are always that way, but it is certainly the human beings who have to basically decide that how these technologies have to be managed, and they have to be managed in a way that it doesn't cause the kind of devastations that they can inflict on the human race. So that is, and that is an ongoing thing. After all, if you look at climate change, in climate change there is a human factor which is contributing to it. And human factor is not just the population growth, but it is also the technologies. So we have to do things. We have to have the renewable energy development. So these things, they continue. Now the third question was China, Iran. Yes, the China-US communiques. They have had separate communiques. So what I would say is that there is no question of China-US bonhomie anymore. That is not going to be there. We have entered a phase where the China-US tensions will persist. But hopefully, as I have argued, they will remain contained. But there are also areas where the two major powers, superpowers, so to say, one is an economic superpower, the other is a superpower in all sense of the word, that they will also be cooperating where it is essential to cooperate. For example, climate change is essential. There can be other areas which I had pointed out. Then apart from that, there is also the old issues like the nuclear dimensions, no arms race, etc. In that the two countries and Russia as well, they have to cooperate with each other because it's a question of common sense and something that in the world will gain acceptance and something which will certainly be seen as irresponsible. So any areas where they may have conflict, and people will ask the question whether who is the aggressor, who is doing what, and nobody would want, on either side of the divide, nobody would want that should lead to the destruction of regions and the world. And today they have the capacity to destroy each other and destroy the regions and world. So that is something which has to be kept in mind. And I am sure that the Chinese will continue to play their role for the development of regions around them, engage in this, and the Americans will also, and there would be a process of adjustment here. Unfortunately, here there is a psychological factor. The West has been on the top in the world order for the last 4 centuries. That has inculcated a certain psyche. And that psyche is not something to be dismissive about. These are facts of the present day world. But because of the fact that the others are also, making gains and developing, therefore, they will also have to adjust. For example, did the United States or the West or any country for that matter wanted Pakistan to be a nuclear power. Now that it became a nuclear power, they have willy-nilly, they have accepted the fact. So this is how the world moves on. In fact, what I see of greater danger is what is happening on our eastern borders, where we don't have now the danger of a military conflict. It has been diffused quite a bit by the recent moves. But Hindutva is a fact of life, and it's a movement. It's a movement comparable to the fascist movements in Europe. And these kinds of movements, they have a life of their own. And who would be the target of these movements? Mainly the target of these kinds of movements in India would be the Indian Muslims and Kashmiris. So we have to think about it, how to approach the whole situation. So I would make these comments that between China and United States, there are areas where they need to cooperate. Afghanistan is one. Afghanistan, if Afghans are able to agree on something, then there would be a need for a great effort for their economic development, and hope China and United States will both be able to participate in that. On Iran, there is the question of the Iranian-US deal. It has a longish name, JOP, something anyway. So hopefully something will come out of that. But it's a complex issue. Yes, on Hong Kong, Taiwan, other issues, there would be bitterness and there would be tensions. But Hong Kong, Taiwan, I have already mentioned that China has been so far very circumspect and cautious in dealing with the Taiwan issue. They are not thinking in terms of militarily taking over, but they are thinking in other terms, economic engagements, etc. And they have gone very far in that, and they have a lobby. They have a very strong lobby in Taiwan, which is pro-China. Then Hong Kong, it's the same situation, but certainly it rankles with the erstwhile imperial power, United Kingdom, and they can't see. They have their own supporters, whereas China has also to be careful in trying to push or be assertive, as you put it, because under Deng Xiaoping, under Jiang Zemin, under Hu Jintao, they basically followed a principle, which was, it's a Chinese saying, hide your light. That is what you are achieving. Don't sort of propagate it and make people start worrying about it. So do things which are necessary to do. They also give an example of which they give to us also, that look, you have to develop and do it like a duck. The duck, when it is in water, it is very calm on the surface, but if you go underwater, you will see that its feet would be very actively flapping and making it move here and there. So means that be circumspect in your approach. So they were circumspect, but Xi Jinping is a different personality. He also became a lifetime president rather than 10-year term. So this is different, but they have to be cautious in dealing with the countries of Southeast Asia and the Far East. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan, for for enlightening us very comprehensively on Sino-US relations. I will very briefly conclude today's discussion by picking some of the highlights from the presentation. Ambassador Riaz started his presentation by giving a context to the discussion by sharing his personal experiences and also shedding light on the on the China's civilization and the psyche of Chinese society. And then you highlighted some of the signs of tensions and confrontation between in the relations between China and the US, which is named as Cold War. But you said that this Cold War is far more different from the Cold War of the past between the US and Soviet Union, because today's situation is different. China is economically integrated in the world. And then you identified some major flashpoints of conflict between China and the US in South China Sea, Taiwan. And then you also highlighted some key areas for cooperation, such as climate change, pandemics, and some common threats. And then furthermore, you advised Pakistan to not allow dilution in its relations with China, because China's relations for Pakistan are indispensable. And you also hope that the US will not impose choices on us to choose between the US and China. And further, you said that in today's age, there is a requirement of cooperation, because in today's world, the parameters of cooperation are also economic. And you said that it does not set well for the US and China to continue confrontation. They will need to manage and adjust to each other's interests. So with this, I end this discussion and hand over the floor to the President IRS for the final vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Nabila. Ambassador Riaz, it was a pleasure, as always, listening to you. It was extremely educative. You gave us your ideas, you gave us your vision and your views of the subject. I guess we have learned a lot, but one thing which I felt that we should have given much more time for the question answer session, because they are diverging viewpoints and it's always good to have a meaningful discussion. But for the audience, I would like to thank from the bottom of my heart, Ambassador Riaz Mohammad Khan. He took much more time than we had agreed upon for this particular webinar. Thank you very much, sir. As always, it is always a pleasure. It is so educative listening to you. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.
Stay safe and blessed. Allah Hafiz.